Hey, NPCers. Today, we're going to be talking about the Roaring Twenties. There's a lot of different topics that we're going to kind of shove together in this video. The Roaring Twenties is known as kind of the clash of cultures: modern America versus traditional America, religious America versus scientific America, rural America versus urban America. And so let's get into these different topics here. A lot of what we remember about the 1920s is pop culture. This is the time period where jazz was coming out and speakeasies because of prohibition, alcohol was illegal. And then we have dance crazes like the Charleston dance, the flappers, the new woman at the time period. They're wearing short dresses and showing off their shoulders and short haircuts. They're smoking, drinking, partying. They have the right to vote now after the 19th Amendment. These are things their mother wouldn't have been caught dead doing. So we have this new rebellious young generation of women who are more independent than the previous generation. This is when Hollywood starts to kick off during this time period, and the movie industry really moves to Hollywood. Entertainment becomes a big part of it. We see the rise of celebrities. This is Charles Lindbergh, the first guy to fly solo across the Atlantic in 27 hours. And so he went from New York to Paris and becomes probably the most famous American during that time period, one of the most famous men in the entire world. We see sports and, like I said, entertainment really taking off. Babe Ruth becomes a sports celebrity during this time period. We see writers, this new generation of writers called the Lost Generation, people like Hemingway, and a lot of these people who were involved in World War I. World War I was all about death and destruction, and they kind of lost hope for the future. Like, what is this life all about? It's just about death. There's no hope for the future. And so they were known as the Lost Generation because they lost their way. A lot of them moved to Paris and lived in Paris during that time period. This is F. Scott Fitzgerald and his wife here. Of course, Fitzgerald wrote The Great Gatsby. Ernest Hemingway is another famous Lost Generation. So this new generation of artists here. Here you can see some of the time period, like on the beach, like measuring to make sure that their swimsuits are long enough that you can't show too much of your leg, going back to that new flapper style. Radio becomes a major thing, and the families kind of gather around the radio to listen to the radio. We don't have TV quite yet. You'll see very, very similar pictures to this in the 1950s. Families gathered around the TV, but the time period is going to be families gathered around the radio. And we also have a bunch of weird random trends, like pole sitting was a thing. And so the people just climb on top of poles and sit there for days as long as they could and have competitions. There's these weird little trends, kind of like the TikTok trends that we see today. So a lot of the things happening in the 1920s, the big picture ideas. And so we can talk about the cars, for example, and how cars transformed America, especially the Model T. We can talk about this kind of clash of cultures and talk about the rise of birth control and civil rights and prohibition and evolution, and how like religion is kind of clashing with some of those things. And then what were the long-term and short-term effects of these clashes, these societal clashes that we have in America. So the Red Scare, Mr. Stafford already talked about it in the previous video. So we're not going to get too much into it, but this sphere of communism continues in 1920. He talked about the Palmer raids. We have another major criminal case here called Sacco and Vanzetti. Sacco and Vanzetti were two Italian immigrants who were charged with murder. They were Italian anarchists, which are probably the worst things you could be in America during the 1920s. America hated Italians and we hated anarchists. And so they were Italian anarchists who were accused of like murdering a shop owner. There's very little evidence dependent on them, but they were sentenced to death in the electric chair. And the world kind of rebelled against this, and they thought they were being executed just because they were anarchists and they had a target on their back, and that they didn't actually have proof that they actually committed their crime. Until this day, it's still a little iffy if they actually committed the crime or not. And so that was kind of this outrage across America with that. Mr. Stafford's also going to cover some of the racial issues that are happening within the 1920s, the Great Migration, some of the race riots. We're going to talk about what's happening with immigration. So we mentioned immigration like in the 1880s, where we saw kind of the beginning of the Progressive Era. We saw like the opening of Ellis Island. We start to restrict immigration. We saw the Chinese Exclusion Act, for example, where the first time ever we say a group of immigrants can't come in. Well, now after World War I, we see a huge flood of immigrants from Europe, war-torn Europe. They're fleeing the war-torn Europe to come to America. And we have just in 1 year, 1920, 1921, we have 800,000 immigrants coming to America. Once again, most of them are going to be Europeans who are fleeing war-torn Europe. And so, oops, sorry about that. This cartoon is a famous cartoon. You'll see about this. So we start to put quotas on how many immigrants can actually come to the country. And so here you see this flood of European immigrants. We're trying to funnel them off. And we put a law saying only 3% can come in. But these laws are somewhat racist when they're put in an act. So we have the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. And this is the very first time America puts a quota on how many people can come to the United States. And it's 3% of your nationality. So for example, if you're Irish, how many Irish are living in America? 3% of that can then come in to to the United States. How many Italians live in America? 3% of that can come to the United States. We eventually add on to that and make it even stricter in 1924. So 1921, the first time we ever put a quota on the Emergency Quota Act. 1924, we make it even stricter. And this time it's going to say 2% rather than 3%. And how do we know who's living in the country? Of course, we use the census. This was in the 1920s. They could have used the 1920 census or the 1910 census or the 1900 census, but they used the census from 1890. Why did they go back 30 years? Well, because that's before all the Italians and Southern Europeans and Eastern Europeans poured in this country. And so by going back before the huge wave of migration, that means those immigrants would have fewer people being allowed in the country. So for an example, let's take a look at the UK. So the UK could send in 65,000 new immigrants, 2% of the British people that are living in America now. 65,000 immigrants can come into the country from the UK. However, from Italy, only 5,000 can come in. So this is a racist policy towards Southern and Eastern Europeans. We specifically moved that census back before the Italians came in. If we would have used the 1910 census after millions of Italians poured in this country, a lot more Italians would have been allowed in. So we specifically chose that 1890 census. We also eventually banned all Asian immigration except for some Filipinos. So no Japanese immigration, no Korean immigration. Of course, the Chinese are already banned. And then with this immigration exception, or this immigration quota, Canadians and Mexicans were exempt from this. So for example, our labor workers and our farm workers were allowed to come in during this time period. We also have the time period of Prohibition, which is what the 1920s is really known for. And so of course, America is this nation of drinkers, and America decided with the 18th Amendment, this 100-year-long battle to get rid of alcohol. With the 18th Amendment, the sale, manufacturing, and distribution of alcohol is illegal. The drinking of alcohol, technically not illegal, but you can't make it, you can't sell it, and you can't distribute it. So it goes into effect in 1920. So people had a year to prepare for this. And so what happens is a lot of people thought it was just going to be like hard alcohol, and they were okay with like, okay, we're going to keep beer and wine, but hard alcohol is gone. However, we had this act come in called the Volstead Act, and the Volstead Act defined what an intoxicating beverage was. And it said anything above 0.5% alcohol, which is like some of your mouthwashes, your kombucha. And so basically beer, wine, hard alcohol, everything is illegal, which a lot of people weren't necessarily okay with. And so what happens is they have a year before the law goes into effect. So people start stockpiling. The Yale Club in New York, for example, stockpiled 14 years worth of booze. And so eventually this leads to the federal government enforcing prohibition, going around and breaking up mobs, breaking up distillers who are illegally brewing alcohol. Here you can see the government dumping out some illegal alcohol that they found. We also see the rise of organized crime during this time period as well. You can get prescriptions just like we had prescriptions for marijuana. You could also get prescriptions for alcohol. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, when he came to America, he was hit by a car, and the prescription they gave him was as much alcohol as he needed during this time period. President Harding, the president during the 1920s, the first part, he didn't even follow prohibition. He had alcohol in the White House. He even had like gambling games with his friends where he lost the White House china and they all sat around and drank. So the president didn't even necessarily follow this. But prohibition is eventually going to fail for a couple reasons. One of the reasons it fails is because it's the rise of organized crime. So now that alcohol is illegal, we see organized crime basically develop to start trading illegally. We have moonshiners, who are people who make it illegally, and then we have bootleggers, who people distribute it illegally. And so it creates this whole black market for alcohol. We have what's called speakeasies, which are these underground bars that the police try and go in and break it up. Of course, some of the more famous people, Bugs Moran, Al Capone, you guys probably all know. Al Capone, of course, served some time up here in Alcatraz. Al Capone was in Chicago. And so we have a lot of these different mob bosses who kind of control different cities, and they run that illegal alcohol trade within those cities. It's said that Al Capone earned up to $100 a minute through the illegal alcohol trade. By 1930, they were making $18 billion a year off of illegal alcohol trade. Of course, Al Capone was eventually busted, not for selling alcohol, but for tax evasion. And eventually he went to jail because of that. And by 1933, in the Great Depression, we decided to get rid of prohibition. The 21st Amendment does away with the 18th Amendment. It's the First Amendment, the only amendment to ever be repealed. And so it was like this 13-year experiment that didn't necessarily work. Not only did it lead to the rise of organized crime, but we only had 1,500 agents nationwide to cover the country. That means there's one federal agent for every 70,000 Americans. Like take the city of Salinas. You have one federal agent to cover the entire city of Salinas to make sure there's no illegal alcohol going in there. So they just didn't have the funding. Wildlife protection had more funding than like ending prohibition did. And so eventually it ends in 1933 during the Great Depression, partly because as Roosevelt said, people need a drink in the Depression, but also to bring tax revenue and create like legal jobs during that time period. So in the next video, we'll jump into some other things happening in the 1920s, but that'll wrap it up for this video here. See you on the next one.